and then away we go. Welcome to this session of the Spears Wealth Insight Forum. My name is Edwin Smith. I'm the editor of Spears, the wealth, business, culture and lifestyle magazine for high net worth individuals and the people who advise them. And I'm delighted to say that I'm joined today by someone who has been described variously as the bad boy of emerging markets and Britain's answer to Warren Buffett. His career has spanned fund management in Hong Kong, the early days of Russian privatization, and the production of artificial meat. He's also a noted philanthropist and has been particularly active in the fields of education and scientific research. Now, though, he's focusing much of his energy on the science of longevity, helping people to live longer, in other words. He says it will lead to the biggest stock market boom ever. What's beyond any doubt is that it's a fascinating field and has massive implications for everyone connected with the world of Spears, whether you're a high net worth individual who might benefit directly from the technology, or a wealth manager with the opportunity to put money into a growing industry, or indeed if you're merely curious enough to want to understand the consequences of this technology for the future of humanity. Jim Mellon, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Edwin. It's nice to see you. And I'm sorry about the last time we tried to connect, but this time is perfect.
This is perfect. Yeah, no, I can see you loud and clear, see you clearly, beaming over from Ibiza, which is fantastic. And now this conversation really came about through a brilliant interview that you gave to one of our writers, Rosika Sitampram, which was in the most recent issue of Spears, which I have here. And when I read the copy that Rosika filed, I found myself sort of, some of the lines were marmalade droppers, as we say in the trade. You know, I couldn't believe it. Let me read one line for the benefit of our audience. For the first time in the history of mankind, the elixir of youth, the promise of living a longer life, will actually come true. And I don't know about our audience, but that certainly captured my imagination. But Jim, perhaps you can start us off by explaining what's up for grabs here, the prize that's on the table for the science of longevity and the work that your company is doing. Juvenescence is the name of it.
Okay, well, thanks, Edwin. The fact of the matter is that this is still a very primitive science. We're in the kind of dial-up phase of the internet of this science. And the people at Juvenescence, among whom are some noted scientists and veteran drug developers, don't know, and nor does anyone for that matter, what's going to work. But what we do know is that something's going to work. And so the way that we constructed our company was to diversify across the various ways in which aging we thought could be made to be malleable. In other words, it could be manipulated to make us longer, or at least for the last part of our lives to be less sick. At the moment, 16% of our lives are characterized by one or more comorbidities. Now, everyone knows what a morbidity is now after the COVID. It means basically a dread disease. And, you know, many people have several comorbidities in the last days of their lives. So at 16% is a long time to be spending in basically misery towards the end of your life. And what our first objective is Juvenescence, is to compress that period of morbidity so that people don't have to be sick. They can be robust in the later stages of their lives. But alongside that, we know because of the unveiling of the human genome and because of subsequent work, as well as the use of artificial intelligence, that there are some key pathways of aging that in animals and organisms, almost certainly in human beings, can be manipulated to cause an extension of life beyond what we regard as our normal lifespans. Normal lifespan at the moment, if you make it to, let's say, 50, will be for a man in the UK about 87. For a woman, it will be a bit older, possibly 90. And as you know, 50% of children born today will make it to 100 based on current technology. So lifespans are increasing, notwithstanding the COVID-19 pandemic mania, and they will continue to increase, but this time they'll increase because of technology, not because of environmental factors. So I'll just very briefly wrap this up by saying that all of lifespan increased since 1900, and it's been a very substantial increase. It's almost doubled, has occurred as a result of the change in environmental factors. So better sanitation, less infant mortality, better nutrition, less wars, less manual labor, and of course, antibiotics and vaccinations, although we're missing one particular vaccination at the moment. And none of it has occurred as a result of any biological change. So if you took someone from 1900, put them in today's environment, they would live just as long as you and I do, or will. And but today we see current technology as enabling most of us who are under the age of 65 or 70, of having a very good shot based on current technology of living to 110 to 120, and that changes everything in the world. With that little opening monologue, I'll give you a chance to jump in there.
Fantastic. No, that's a brilliant summary. Thank you very much. I mean, one of the things that I'm interested, or that interested me when I read that interview and some of the work you've done in your book, Juvenescence, is this idea that we should change the way that we think about aging. So at the moment, well, there's nothing so certain as death and taxes, but perhaps that's actually only half true.
No, I think death is still certain, I'm afraid, Edwin. And, there are people out there who say that, mankind might be a sort of disembodied hologram sort of hanging on a wall with our consciousness transferred into some permanent state. I don't know if I'd want to live in that sort of existence. There are people who, cryopreserve their bodies, hoping for some sort of cure for aging in the next 20 years or so. But I think that ultimately, since aging is the outrunning of our repair mechanisms by wear and tear, that will carry on, at least in the foreseeable future and for our lifetimes. So we will die at a certain point. It's just that our deaths will be deferred way beyond what we currently think is the normal paradigm, which is to be born, to learn, to earn, to retire, and to expire. The whole of life is changing, and it's not just because of medical technology. It's because of the new ways of working, the progress of technology, meaning that young people, as we all know, are going to have to do multiple jobs in their working lives. We know that people are going to have to work a lot longer. We know that education will be a continuum, and we know that we can't foresee the future because the future changes so quickly. And that many industries that we regard as sacrosanct today may not exist in 20 years' time. For instance, I was talking to my brother-in-law last night about the internet. He's writing a book on the internet. And I said, well, could you envisage a world in which the internet doesn't exist, but something else replaces it? Mm-hmm. And he said, absolutely. Because, in my lifetime, I mean, I know the internet existed prior to me being alive, but it didn't exist in a form that we recognize today. But in my lifetime, it's become indispensable, and in yours as well. Well, what's to say that something else can't come along and supplant it? So everything is changing, but particularly in medical technology. And it's in medical technology that the change is not particularly evident to the broad population. And it's not evident because it's in bits and pieces, and it's not something you can hold in your hand, at least not yet. So I'll give you an example, if I may. Yeah. In 2012, I wrote my first book on bioscience called Cracking the Code. And then the most recent reprint of Juvenescence was last year, 2019. And in that period of 7 years, you had the cure for hepatitis C. It didn't exist in 2012. And now if you've got hepatitis C, you can be cured of it. Cured, not just, symptoms alleviated, but absolutely cured. The CRISPR-Cas9 that everyone is familiar with, form of gene editing and subsequent variants, did not exist in 2012. Artificial intelligence for the development of novel compounds, which is very important to us, didn't exist in 2012. And now, instead of taking 3 years to develop a new drug, it can be done in 21 days, which is incredible. It will get shorter and shorter and shorter. We will eventually have personalized medicine, where a doctor will formulate a specific drug for you or a specific drug for me. And then lastly, and not least, is cancer immunotherapy. It didn't exist in 2012, and I can tell you this year, cancer immunotherapy will be a $200 billion US dollar industry. And if you've got some of the cancers that were formerly intractable, some of the forms of leukemia or blood cancers, the cures now through immunotherapy are biblical. So all that happened in 7 years. So my point is, we don't know what's going to happen in the next 7 years, but it's going to be good. And it's going to be particularly focused on curing or alleviating or treating the diseases of aging.
Okay. And I mean, you've said that you're confident in predicting this, the science of longevity will represent the biggest industry on the planet in 20 years' time. Now, that's quite a claim, but from what you've said so far, sounds quite plausible as well. I mean, it's all up for grabs, as you say, nothing's decided, and there are lots of interesting technologies in play. But can you sort of sketch out how it might evolve, how it might happen, put a bit of meat on those bones?
Yeah, I mean, already health is the biggest industry on the planet, healthcare.
Yep.
There's nothing that exceeds it. And what the science of longevity will do will be to displace some of the elements of healthcare spending today into preventative treatments that will stop people, for instance, going into the most expensive hospital stay, hotel stay they ever have, which is going into hospital, or having to have, you know, their hips replaced, or things like that, which are incredibly expensive, or, for instance, having their legs amputated because they've got diabetic foot ulcers as a result of the explosion in diabetes in the world. So the science of longevity will be displacing some of that existing expenditure. On top of that, there are 7.8 billion people in the world. That figure is rising, albeit much more slowly than it used to. And it wouldn't be surprising if all of those people over the age of 30 are presented with the opportunity of living another 10 extra years of healthy life, wouldn't spend some of their income on keeping themselves alive for another 10 years of healthy living. And as a result, since every other industry is concentrated on a group of people, not everyone on the planet, this could be in fact, it will be the biggest industry on the planet, because there aren't many people I know who would say, no, I prefer to die at 85 in misery rather than dying at 110 in my bed without knowing about it. And so that's why I can confidently predict displacement of existing healthcare plus new industries based on technologies that are evolving quickly to give us another 10 years of healthy life will make this the biggest industry on the planet.
Fantastic. And you're a big part of this, or Juvenescence at least hopes to be a growing part of it. Can you talk a little bit about the business, the philosophy that underpins it, and the structure that underpins it as well, and how you're taking the steps in this industry?
That's a great question. So basically, I started this company with Greg Bailey, long-standing business partner, Dec Dugan, ditto, and we started it, I wouldn't say blind, because I've been around the States and written this book and met all the key opinion leaders, or at least all the ones that we could identify in the field. And we raised what you might call a blind pool of capital. So over the last 2 years since the company was started, we've raised about $170 million US, of which a fair chunk has been contributed by Greg and myself. We've had experience in investing in biotech and in founding companies, and particularly Dec Dugan in drug development, which is a real art as well as being a science. And so Dec was the head of drug development at Pfizer for a long period of time worldwide, the world's biggest drug company. And then he went on to turn around the fortunes of a company called Amarin, which today is a multi-billion-dollar company with a drug on the market. And then the three of us co-founded a company called Biohaven, and we paid $3 million for 54% of that company 5 years ago. It's now about $4 and a bit billion on the New York Stock Exchange, and it has a drug for the treatment of migraine on the market. I say that basically because it shows Dec's particular skills and identifying people who are good at developing drugs and also shepherding those people through the various stages of drug development. So our main thrust in Juvenescence is to develop drugs that will have very specific applications beyond just aging. So they will address an unmet medical need of whatever type. So we are involved in, for instance, the development of a drug for cachexia, a drug for the treatment of osteoarthritis and age-related macular degeneration. We're involved in a drug for obesity. But beyond those specific applications, we're looking at biomarkers to see if those drugs, as we expect, have a pro-longevity effect using the biomarkers, basically biological clocks, to ascertain whether the drugs have the effect on human beings of turning back the clock, halting the clock, or slowing down the clock. And it is absolutely the case. There is a study released last year by a man called Greg Fahy and a number of other scientists that the combination of some drugs, including metformin, including human growth hormone, darcetinib and quercetin, which act as senolytic drugs, removing senescent cells from the body, reverses biological clocks. So we already have the very early signals that this stuff works. So that's one element of our business. The other element of our business is to use stem cells, to use technical processes to effectively replace body parts. Rather like a classic car can look as though it came out of the showroom, but may have been made 100 years ago, to replace body parts. And we have a company that is in phase 2 trials now for exactly that, which is absolutely super exciting. And to go straight into phase 2 trials with a business that's just 2 years old is incredible. And then we have a consumer-facing division that looks at finding supplements that are made by approved ingredients in the FDA to slow the process of aging. And our first one, which is a ketone ester, will be on the market in the US by the end of this year. It's called Metabolic Switch, and it comes out of the Buck Institute, which is the world's leading anti-aging research institution. And so we have 20 projects because we don't know which ones are going to work. But what we do know from our successes in biotech in the past, where we've had failures as well, is that if you diversify your portfolio, and let's say you've got 10 projects and we have 20, as I just said, and you get 2 or 3 right, that's enough to make huge returns for shareholders. But that's not really the point for us. Our company will be going public quite soon in the US, and we are going to lock ourselves up for an extraordinary period compared to other founders, because we believe in our central mission, which is to add 10 years of healthy life for everyone on the planet, not just for the elites, not just for Spears magazine readers, but ultimately for everyone on the planet. And that's our mission. And when our mission is accomplished, we can wind down Juvenescence and live off the proceeds, hopefully.
Fantastic. Well, it sounds like a good plan. I mean, the idea of making this widely available, not just to the wealthiest people who can afford it, is an interesting one. I mean, one would assume that wouldn't naturally be the way that new technology is disseminated through the population, but it sounds like you have a plan to pursue a different model.
Well, there are 2 aspects to this. One is that all drugs have a patent life. In fact, any new discovery has a patent life, and it's typically 20 years. Because it takes quite a long time for the drugs to get on the market, and it costs a lot of money, there has to be a price for innovation. So typically the early adopters, the people who get these drugs first, or their insurance companies or their governments are paying quite a lot for them. Sure. But because we are a long-lived species, 10 years, which is the period of typical commercial exploitation, goes by in the blink of an eye. And as a result, when those drugs come off patent, they become generic and they become as cheap as chips. And I'd like to give you a quick example, if I may. Please. So in the 1980s, the hottest drugs around were, believe it or not, drugs to combat ulcers. And drugs like Tagamet, omeprazole, and Zantac were among the most expensive drugs on the market, because their makers priced them very highly to recoup the costs of innovation, plus all the other failures and other drugs that they had in their portfolios. As soon as the drugs came off patent, they became generic. And if you go into Boots today, you can buy Zantac for a penny, for nothing. And so it will be with the drugs that we and others are developing in the longevity field. So it's that's one aspect. The second is that there are other areas that are of interest in longevity beyond just drugs. Mm-hmm. One is the organ regeneration I just mentioned earlier on. And the other, of course, is gene therapy. Now, gene therapy at the moment is rarely used in humans, only in the most extraordinarily narrow of indications. And it's not used in humans because it's not perfect yet, but one day it will be perfect. And one day it will be used to extend our lifespans, or our healthy lifespans, because it is absolutely clear that there are some people on the planet, pockets of people, and I'm not talking about the people in the blue zones, I'm talking about people with genetic variants who live longer and healthier than the rest of us. Yes. And those genes at some point, and I know this will happen, will be inculcated into the rest of the population to confer upon us, the people who, or maybe you already have it, but I don't know if I have it, I doubt it, but there are very, very few of these people, to give robustness in old age to the rest of us. And so gene therapy will be a very important part of this. To begin with, that will be super expensive. Ultimately, it will be very cheap. So it's like everything else. To begin with, the early adopters pay a lot. The iPad buyers when they first came out 10 years ago, they were very expensive. Now everyone can have one, or smartphone be another good example. So it will be widely disseminated for everyone. Already, however, just very, very briefly, there are drugs out there which we know are pro-longevity and which will be in wide dispersion for the general population that are pro-longevity. And those drugs would include metformin and rapamycin as examples, both of which absolutely confer extra life on all mammalian species, including humans.
Okay, fantastic. And I mean, one of the things that I read with interest in your interviews talk of species that already exist in nature where aging isn't necessarily part of their makeup, and sort of identifying these examples in nature and perhaps transferring what they have to human life is a plausible prospect. It might be worth talking a little bit about that, those examples in nature that are particularly interesting.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there are creatures out there that exhibit negligible senescence. It means it doesn't seem that they age. They all die because they get predated. Someone comes along and another creature comes along, eats them, or they have an accident or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. But those would include, for instance, the American lobster, would include certain sharks, whales, and they do seem to live a very, very long life. And if you remember, we are just, no matter what we think, we're just a collection of atoms and molecules, and they are just a collection of atoms and molecules. And the rearrangement of our atoms and molecules in the same way as theirs are arranged is something for the future. It may be 20, 30, 40, 50 years off, but it's certainly the case that some of the elements of nature, which most people think that human beings live longer than any other creature, is just not the case. I mean, you've got turtles in the Galapagos that can live for hundreds of years. Those elements will eventually find their way into our germlines, but that's way out in the future. What I'm talking about now is us getting to 110 and 120, which is at the moment the sort of upper ceiling of human lifespan, on a regular basis, using today's technology. And let's just put this in perspective. In 1917, the King of England, who was then the king, sent out telegrams to everyone in the British Commonwealth. It wasn't the Commonwealth, it was the Empire then, who was either 100 or over 100. And he sent out 24 telegrams in 1917. Today, there are about 20,000 centenarians in the UK. And in worldwide, there are well over 600,000. It is estimated, without any great clinical interventions, but there will be plenty of clinical interventions, that by the year 2100, there'll be 100 million centenarians. Wow. So the pace of change is quite dramatic. I'm sure the figure will be much higher, by the way. So just to put everything in perspective, and for those people who don't appreciate the scale of this, it's my friend Andrew Scott has written that it's a bit like waking up every day and having 36 hours ahead of you instead of the 24 that we expect. How are we going to fill those days? Yeah. How are we going to pay for those days? Yeah. What's our relationship patterns going to be like? Will people have children? Will they have less children? Will they have children much later in life? It's going to be a real huge change. But it's possible to understand and embrace that change because it's already happened once. In the last century, human life expectancy has almost doubled, but we're coping with it, aren't we? So why couldn't we cope with it for another 50% increase?
Well, we are for the moment. And I mean, if you said to me, you know, Edwin, would you like to live a longer, healthier life? I would say, yes, absolutely, please. I'll sign. So where do I sign? But what's good for one person on an individual basis isn't necessarily always good for everyone on a mass scale. I mean, an economist might say, Jim, stop. We've already got problems as it is with aging societies and dependent people and so forth. We're going to have to find solutions. I mean, is this part of the picture? I suppose perhaps it's not, you know, you don't see it as your responsibility. You think it's a good thing what you're doing regardless, and it's someone else's job to think about those types of things. But do you think about these at all?
Yes, absolutely. Because if you think about it, if people lived, let's say today, to their late 80s, and then they ended up living to 110 or 120, but they were all in wheelchairs dribbling in nursing homes,
yeah,
it would be unaffordable, unsustainable, and pretty awful for the people who are in that position. So that's not what we're looking at. What we're looking at is people being robust almost to the end of their much extended lives, in which case they can carry on working or doing some form of work and won't require, they won't be dependent until much later in their lives. I mean, let's face it, we're all going to have to work longer anyway. And we're just going to have to work that much longer, you know, into our 80s. I know it sounds ridiculous at the moment, but it's going to be the case. And in those circumstances, things don't appear to be nearly as bad. And the other thing is that at the moment, the healthcare systems around the world are overwhelmed with older people with frail conditions. So first of all, we know that COVID-19 is so-called gero-lavic. You know, it picks off the old people. If you're you know, under 65, you're unlikely to die of it. If you're 80 plus and you've got comorbidities and obese, then that's it. You know, you've got a good chance of going. Yeah. Which is why the second wave won't be nearly as bad as the first wave, in my estimation anyway. And so we need to build immunoresilience into elderly people so that they aren't such a big drain on the healthcare systems. And if the healthcare systems, which currently occupy somewhere between 10 and 20% of developed countries' GDPs, don't have that burden of frail elderly occupying half the beds and you know, occupying a huge amount of the percentage of the expenditures, then maybe there might be more money to go around for other things, such as social care, which is woefully underappreciated at the moment, or empathetic professions, which again are underappreciated. So I think it's an optimistic view that we have, but it's one that's really grounded in science. And if I give you an example, all the frailty, just about all the frailty in old people comes from the buildup of senescent or limbo-like cells that sort of are between healthy functioning and apoptosis or programmed death. And as we get older, we get more and more of them. I mean, it's not a huge percentage at any point in your life, but it's enough to cause this so-called SASP, which is a secretory phenomenon that causes all the inflammation in the elderly body. And so that's why they get osteoarthritis or age-related macular degeneration or osteoporosis and so forth. It's because of the buildup of senescent cells. Now, people are, including us, are working on senolytic drugs to remove those cells selectively. I'm sure that someone is going to get a drug that works in that area. We don't know who, we don't know when, but that will relieve a lot of the burden in the elderly. And secondly, I guess most people will know this, the thymus, which sits around here, is, as time goes on, it involutes or it shrinks to nothing in elderly people. By the time you're 85, you don't have a thymus left. Now, why is that important? Because the thymus is where your new T cells are produced, hence the word T. And bone marrow cells, which are the B cells, go to the thymus to be matured. So the T and B cells become much less abundant as you get older, which means your immune system is compromised, which is one of the main reasons why the old get taken by both viral and bacterial disease. And so one of our companies is working on regrowing thymic tissue. And that sounds like science fiction, but in our liver regeneration program, which is now in the phase 2 trial in the United States, the 400 animals, including dogs and pigs, which have similar organ structures to us, were treated, and every single one of them responded in a positive way. There wasn't a single failure. So we expect it to work in humans. We don't know about the thymic tissue, but we're working in animals at the moment on that. But if we can replace the thymus, you go a long way to helping old people to remain robust and not to be taken by respiratory diseases or by diseases like C. difficile, for instance, because of their compromised immune systems.
And so do you expect in this future world for people to die in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, if you believe, as some people do, and I think they're out there on the wacky side, to be quite honest, that humans ultimately be able to live forever, they won't, because there'll be some accident that will befall them. And it's been estimated that if there was no disease and there was no deterioration in our bodies over time, that the average age of death would be around 1,000, because we would be killed in an accident. Now, by then, I assume there'll be no cars, there'll be no everything that we're familiar with that kills people won't be around. But I'm sure there'll be other ways in which you will be able to die, or you'll just die of loneliness, boredom, or commit suicide, which is another, do people live ultra long lives? They may just end up being suicidal with no end in sight, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I think that the way that we will die, from the point of view of you, me, and the readers of Spears, will likely be of a very short illness, which will probably will represent exhaustion, like a languid sort of longer, if that's the right way of putting it. And it will be a very quick illness, and we'll just die in our beds. And that will be a much better way than most people's deaths at the moment, which are either from cardiovascular disease, the biggest killer in the world. About 30% of people die from that. Cancer, which is about 15% of all deaths. Respiratory disease, obesity, and the worst one of all, of course, is Alzheimer's and dementia, which only accounts for 8% of deaths, but accounts for a large majority of our fear of death. And I can give you good news on that. We've got an exceptional team from Harvard that are working on a pill that you can take in your 40s and 50s and will stop you from getting dementia before the tau protein tangles and the amyloid plaques build up, by which time it's too late.
And you mentioned that team in the US. There are also teams in the UK, I think, working on Juvenescence associated projects. I mean, what do you think the UK bioscience industry has to do to sort of cement its place, or even to catch up with the US?
Well, it's got a very long way to go, but the good news is that the UK is second in the world in cutting edge bioscience. And but the problem, as you well know, is that the nexus of venture capital, universities, and scientist entrepreneurs is not as strong in the UK, or anywhere else for that matter, as it is in the US. So almost everything that we've invested in so far, even though we're a British or Isle of Man stroke UK centric company, is in the US. But we're very anxious to see that change. So as an example, our COO in Juvenescence was formerly the CEO of the Crick, which you'll be familiar with, around King's Cross. And most of our senior executive team are British and anxiously trying to find stuff in the UK, be it out of Oxford, where we're working on a couple of deals, or Glasgow University, again, working on a couple of deals, or Brighton or Southampton. Okay,
fantastic. And I want to move briefly on to some other areas of your career and other topics, if we may. I know in the past that you've said that the benefit of the shareholders is and should remain the top priority of every business. But it seems that that worldview, if we can call it that, might be under threat. There was a group of 180 or so American CEOs, part of the Business Roundtable group, that signed an open letter last year saying that all stakeholders, not just shareholders, should be considered in the purpose of a corporation. And that sort of feeling seems to be gaining more and more popularity, but it's by no means clear that it is actually the right way of thinking. I mean, what's your view now? Have you moved at all in that direction in recent years, or not?
Well, that's a great question, and I think it goes back to my days as a fund manager. I mean, you know, I was always against companies that had, because I was working in the Far East, you know, Japanese companies that were more interested in preserving the employment of their staff than in any benefit for shareholders, although that's changing in Japan. I do think that ESG investing is here to stay, and about 1 in 5 institutional dollars now goes into ESG, and I'm sure that figure will rise. And I think some of that is self-interest, because it's quite clearly in our own businesses self-interest to go to areas where investment is going to be most profitable. And you know, Juvenescence is a good example. It's an ultimate impact investment, ESG type investment, which does good for mankind, but also has a laser focus on the bottom line, because without that, you can't make a successful business. Equally, I think it's in the best interests of oil companies to start thinking of themselves as self-liquidating trusts with a bias towards renewable energy, because they know how to produce and to distribute energy. And BP is a very good example of that. So I think it's a more nuanced argument now than my days when I was a sort of brash young fund manager sitting in Hong Kong. I think that there is a role for companies to consider all their stakeholders, but they should it's a delicate balance, because you don't want companies to become some sort of you know, enterprise that's designed for the benefit of the solely of the employees, without due regard to the shareholders who put up the capital in the first place. So we don't want to destroy capitalism by over embracing a sort of world, and a fuzzy world where the bottom line isn't important.
Sure. And I mean, we're in uncertain economic times now. And after the previous crash in sort of 2007-8, you released a book, Top 10 Investments to Survive the Crunch. I wondered if you might sort of repeat that feat and offer some advice to anyone trying to navigate the coronavirus economic fallout now.
Well, this is a very different type of crash, because it's self-induced, as we know. And, you know, I don't think anyone can really point fingers at the handling or otherwise between nations yet, because we just don't know what the fallout or the recovery rate will be. But what I would say is, in the UK, there is better value in the stock market than there is in the US, where you've had this bro culture, Robin Hood culture, pumping up, you know, ridiculous stories to extreme and very dangerous valuations based on a sea of money that's been produced by the Fed. And you know, today you saw Nikola, which is the truck company, the chairman's resigned. I no doubt the shares will go down by 75% or something today, but people have pushed the value of that up to some ludicrous level. And we haven't had that in the UK, because we don't have this sort of army of retail day traders like they've developed in the US.
Sure.
And so the UK market, to me, seems rather attractive at the moment. And what I would say is that the worst performing cyclical stocks, which are based on the industries that have been worst affected, such as airlines, hospitality, banks, even though the banks haven't really been affected very badly, they just, you know, they reflect the malaise in economies, are probably the ones to buy now. And so if I was recommending shares today, I would say Delta Airlines in the US, which is absolutely the strongest airline in the US and will come through very well post this pandemic. IAG in the UK, which is doing a rights issue at the moment, which I think will be another major survivor and will produce super profits over the next couple of years, because this is not going to last very long. I don't think we're coming to the end stages now. And then you've got, in the UK, albeit not a particularly well-managed institution, you've got Lloyds Bank, which to me, as the dominant retail bank with hopefully a change of board and management upcoming, has superb prospects for profit and dividend generation. Those would be the type of stocks, and even the oil companies, you know, unfashionable and unloved as they are, I would say that BP and Shell are extremely good buys at this stage. But it would be a big mistake, in my view, to start buying the tech companies in the US just based on momentum, because the momentum is fading. I can see it now. We're seeing a fading momentum in the FANG and other high-profile stocks that they're not good. And then the last thing I would say is that we are going to head into a world of inflation. It may not be this year, it may not be next year, but it's coming, because you can't print all this money and create all this credit and then have a tightening economy without inflation. And so every single person should have gold and silver or some representation thereof in their portfolios. Okay.
And I also wanted to ask you about giving. I mean, you're a philanthropist, and you've given, particularly in education and scientific research, as I mentioned. As this month, we've seen the death of Chuck Feeney, the DFS duty-free entrepreneur who sought to give away, I think, all of his, the vast majority of his wealth during his lifetime. I mean, from your experience, is there a model that works particularly for giving? Because philanthropy is a complicated subject that sometimes isn't always dealt with satisfactorily from the point of view of H&Ws. But do you have learnings and advice that you might share for people who are wrestling with this question?
Well, I'm not. I don't know about Chuck Feeney, but I'm certainly not in the league of the super givers by any shot of the imagination. And it's very difficult, because getting back to the subject of longevity, if we think we're going to live to 110 or 120, giving all your money away by the age of 85 and having nothing left may not be the best idea. It's also the case that if you give your money to charitable foundations, it will never be, if you're a successful fund manager or investor, it will never be as well managed in those foundations as it is by yourself, the creator of the money in the first place. So there has to be some balance between lifetime giving and post-life giving, but give one must. And it's certainly my expectation that my money will be given away over time. But I hope that's quite a long period of time, and I hope there's more to give away, because there are so many wonderful things to be supported. But the best example of good giving anywhere, and if he was a member of the Roman Catholic Church, I hope he would be so elevated, is Bill Gates, because he is actually a saint of modern times. And he's one of these people, a bit like Chuck Feeney, who made a lot of money very, very quickly in the early age, and at an early age, and then never needed any more money, although he carried on making lots of money. By the way, I met Chuck Feeney because one of my dear friends is married to one of his daughters. Oh, really? So I met him, but his was a slow decline. I can't remember if he had Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or one of those dread diseases, but you know, the last few years of his life were miserable. And you can have all the money in the world and yet end up in a miserable state in your later years, because money does not buy you necessarily health. So for all those very rich people out there, give some money to the science of longevity, because it may be to your personal benefit as well as to the benefit of humanity.
Right. And you mentioned Bill Gates. I mean, he was moved to sort of enter the public forum, I think last year, when it was very fashionable to discuss the role of wealthy people in society, and sort of this question of whether it should even be possible for someone to accrue as much as $1 billion or more. And Elizabeth Warren, and we've seen Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in America sort of push this idea that perhaps billionaires shouldn't be even exist, shouldn't have the right to exist. But Bill Gates thinks that they should, and he's argued eloquently that case. I mean, what's your view on that subject? Or perhaps more broadly about how the wealthy are seen in society?
Yeah, again, I mean, I don't really know. I would have thought that one, to allow people to make as much as they can in their lifetimes, and then to, if you've got a huge surplus when you die and you haven't distributed it, then, you know, take some off the heirs and give it to, the problem is that that's a form of tax that just goes back to the government, which is not necessarily the best allocator of funding. I would have thought that anyone who is fortunate enough to be really, really rich should make plans to distribute it before they die. But I don't really have any specific guidance on this. I would just say that, you know, if you have got money, you're fortunate enough, give some away. I was reading yesterday that the UK is the second most charitable country in the world among major countries, and we give away 0.7% of our GDP individually to the less fortunate, whereas in America they give away 2%. So the culture of giving in America is much greater than any other country of the world, and so, you know, let them make their money and let them give it away, I think, is the best way of doing it.
Very good. And a couple of questions on sort of geopolitics, if I may. Your father was a diplomat. You've done business in Russia, and one of the big questions, and it is a big question, so apologies for putting you on the spot, that we face in the West is how to approach Vladimir Putin's Russia. I mean, what's your sense of that, given your knowledge of Russia and your diplomatic heritage?
Well, if I've got a diplomatic heritage, the best thing to do is to say nothing. But the fact is that my fund management and actually economic involvement in Russia ended in before 2000, and although, you know, everyone who's ever had anything to do with Russia is, and it was my big break, actually, you know, investing in the privatizations of Russian companies, in a small, relatively small way, not in like control way. But those were very different times, and Putin wasn't around when we invested. You know, I honestly, I'm not in favor of any foreign interference in any elections anywhere, and I'm not in favor of the platforms that make that possible. And I point out, in particular, Facebook, which I have a very low opinion of.
Okay, very good. And one final word, if you don't mind, on Britain's future outside the EU. I mean, you have been an ardent Brexiteer. I mean, can you sketch a picture, an optimistic picture perhaps, for us of what Britain's role on the world stage might be like in 5-10 years' time, or perhaps even further?
Well, I've never been an advocate of leaving the European Union for reasons of sovereignty or reasons of anti-immigration. I've always been an exponent of the economic view, which is that because our nation, our economy is very different to those, mostly those in the European Union, we'd be better off outside. And we don't know yet, because the pandemic, just at the point when we're about to fully leave the European Union, has swamped everything. So, you know, people have been arguing about whether it's 1% plus or 1% minus in GDP, and here we are in the second quarter, down 21%. So everything has been distorted by the pandemic. But my general view is that coming out of this, assuming that we have a reasonable sailor at the helm, is that the UK should do quite well because of its very strong finance sector, because of its very strong knowledge-based industries, and because we do have absolutely, on a per capita basis, the best universities in the world, which feed entrepreneurialism, and because we'll also be able to take the best from around the world into the country. And we should embrace immigration. We should let anyone who can make a positive contribution come into the country. We shouldn't be afraid of that. That was not a good reason for Brexit. It's the worst reason for Brexit, actually. And so I'm reasonably optimistic. And by the way, I know that this will go out before negotiations are concluded, but I'm absolutely sure, because you can see it in the performance of the British pound, that that there'll be an agreement between the EU and the UK, so we won't have a no deal Brexit. There won't be goods tariffs, there won't be quotas. There'll be some regulations presumably, but this is not going to be the disaster that many in the newspapers are forecasting. So overall, just maintain a sort of balanced view. It's neither going to be hugely bad nor hugely good for the UK, but it's nothing in comparison to what we're facing at the moment. And on that note, I'll say that this is, as someone described it, a case-demic now, not a pandemic. Large numbers of new cases, not a lot of hospitalizations, not a lot of deaths. And the US had its big second wave in the last 2 or 3 months. That seems to be abating with not that many deaths. So don't be despondent about this current increase. I hope the government doesn't lock the UK down. It would be a very big mistake.
Well, yes, fingers crossed we come out of this sooner rather than later. Jim, that's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed for joining us at the Spears Wealth Insight Forum. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you.
Same here, Edwin, and I appreciate your interest, and thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you very much.